Thank you to all of you for coming, for being here today on the campus here at Catholic University. Thank you to all of you who are tuning in, watching from home or from other places. My name is Stephen White. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Project here at the Catholic University of America. It's my pleasure to introduce our report, which will be, the data will be presented by my colleague, Dr. Vaidyanathan. I want to thank our team, not only Brandon, but Dr. Stephen Cranny, our data scientist, and my colleague at the Catholic Project, Sarah Perla. We've put in a lot of long hours on getting this data out and ready for publication. We hope that it is of interest to you and ultimately helpful to the Church. The Catholic Project has been working on this and similar research for years now. You will recall our first survey, the National Study of Catholic Priests. The results from that were published in October of 2022. That data was given a second gloss in a report of 2023. And now we have our first partially longitudinal study looking at some new data that we'll present. The data from the first study from 2022 produced a lot of results, not only the reports that we came out with through the Catholic Project, but we were also able to turn it into an edited volume. I'm sure you can see it very well from home. Rebuilding Trust, Priest Morale in the Wake of the Clergy Abuse Crisis, from CUA Press, which is out now or available online for purchase. So if you're interested, you can check that out. We're very proud of that volume. As I said, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Vaidyanathan, to present our data. He will present the data for you, and then we will have a chance for question and answer following. So without further ado, Dr. Vaidyanathan.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks again for tuning in, for those of you who are watching from elsewhere, and thanks for showing up for those of you who are here. I want to say a little bit about the results of this project, that we're now in the second wave of this national study of Catholic priests. You might recall this is the largest nationally representative survey of both diocesan and religious priests that's been conducted in more than half a century. In 2022, in our first wave, we had reached out to 10,000 priests, a mathematically representative sample of 10,000 Catholic priests in the US, and we got a 36% response rate. And in 2025, between May and June, what we did was reached out to the priests who had completed that first survey. And of that population, we had a 36% response from those who had taken the first survey. So that's a total of 1,164 priests. And as we looked at the demographic data on this, there's no significant differences between the descriptive demographics of both these waves, other than a reduction in the number of foreign-born priests. So that's the only difference you can see between the two samples from wave 1 and wave 2. There are fewer foreign-born priests in the second study, but other than that, there's no bias of any sort that we can glean. There are three main themes that I want to talk to you about today. The first is well-being and burnout among priests and how that tracks over time. The second is trust in bishops, which you might recall was one of the key themes of the first wave. And thirdly, we want to look at priests' attitudes on a number of key issues. This is a set of new questions that we've asked priests. These were not in the first wave. And we're looking at particularly their pastoral priorities, what they think ought to be the priorities for the Church in the US, and then especially their views on synodality. So let's talk about well-being and burnout. The way in which we measure well-being is through an instrument called the Harvard Flourishing Index, and this is a multidimensional scale of well-being which includes physical and mental health, sense of purpose, character, and social relationships. And this is typically scored from 0 to 100. There are 10 items, and then on this scale, the Harvard Flourishing Index, you see that both diocesan and religious priests score 82 out of 100. This is identical to the first survey. This is absolutely no change in the mean flourishing score between 2022 and 2025. And this score is much higher than what the Flourishing Index garners in the general population. So typically, members of the public score somewhere between 60 and 70, and priests are doing much better than the general public when it comes to their sense of overall flourishing. And one of the things we did differently in the second wave is, in addition to these general questions about individual flourishing, so these are about individual mental health and physical health and well-being and so on, we asked priests to assess the extent to which their dioceses or religious communities are flourishing. And that's a new question we developed with the Harvard team, and asked priests to score it on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being not at all and 10 being fully flourishing. And here we see an interesting difference. So if you take your personal flourishing scores as averaging 8.2 on 10, right? We just combine that, the 82 score, you see that the community flourishing scores are much lower. So 5.7 on average for diocese, and 6.2 for one's religious community. So this is pretty curious. We don't quite know why they're giving these dioceses or religious communities a significantly lower score than their own personal well-being score, and that's something that we think merits future study and analysis. A second aspect of well-being that we look at is burnout, and to measure burnout in ministry, we replicated a set of questions from a Notre Dame study called the Flourishing in Ministry Survey, conducted by Matt Bloom. And there are three main indicators of burnout that we look at. The first one is, it happens more and more often that I talk about my ministry in a negative way, so this is a cynicism measure. The second is, during my ministry work, I often feel emotionally drained, so that's a measure of emotional exhaustion. And the third one is, I usually feel worn out and weary after my ministry work. So what we find here in looking at priests is there is a difference, which we saw in the first wave as well, that diocesan priests are showing higher levels of burnout compared to religious priests. I'm not showing you the comparison across waves, but you can just see the comparison between diocesan and religious priests. And we see here that 56% of diocesan priests indicate no burnout compared to 69% of religious priests. 44% of diocesan priests are showing at least one indicator of burnout compared to about 30% of religious priests. And 7% of diocesan priests indicate all three criteria for burnout compared to only 2% of religious. So this is actually slightly improved from the first wave. Again, I'm not showing you the comparisons over time, but there's a modest improvement. So priest burnout rates are actually getting better. They're reducing in their experience of burnout, but you can still see this important difference between religious and diocesan priests and burnout. One of the factors that we thought might contribute to burnout is a sense that one feels expected to do too many things that go beyond their calling as a priest. And here we can see that priests, if you compare ordination cohorts, comparing those who were ordained before 1980 to those ordained since 2000, you see that the more recently ordained priests are much more likely, many more of them feel that they're doing too many things beyond what they think ought to be their primary tasks as priests. And here in some of the open-ended questions at the end of the survey, you see a lot of complaints about bureaucratic paperwork, administrative tasks that they think are just taking away too much of their time and leaving them with little time and energy for ministry. The second theme I want to talk to you about is trust in bishops. So here, one of the things we find is a modest improvement again over time. So when you look on the left, you see a diocesan priest's average level of trust in his own bishop, and you see that over time, in 2022, we found that there was quite a drop since 2001, right? 49% of diocesan priests in 2022 said that they expressed that they felt they were confident in the decision-making and leadership of their diocesan bishop. Now that average has gone up slightly higher to 52%, so there's a modest improvement there. And similarly, when you look at all of U.S. priests, both diocesan and religious, trust in the U.S. bishops, you see that too has gone up by 5 percentage points from 22 to 27%. So still a long way to go if you want high levels of trust, but it's some good news for those who are interested in rebuilding trust, as we are, and so this is a good change to see. Something else we wanted to assess was, what are the factors that predict trust in one's diocesan bishop? So in our previous study, you might recall that we had noticed that it was political and theological alignment, the sense that the priest shares political and theological views with his bishop. Those were the strongest predictors. But we added a few more indicators this time, and we find that the the strongest predictor, actually, net of other factors, of one's trust in his bishop is, I feel that my bishop cares about me. That sense of we had, in our previous study, recognized that priests really wanted their bishops to be fathers, and that theme came up repeatedly, and so we think this echoes that finding as well. Priests want to feel that their bishop personally cares about them, and that factor matters significantly more, substantially more than other factors, including political and theological alignment. So that's, again, an important theme. In fact, 72% of priests who feel that their bishop cares about them trust their bishop, compared to only 10% of priests who say their bishop does not care about them. We also did want to look a little bit further into the political and theological alignment, and we were trying to assess whether there might be any kind of overall skew. Is it the case that most priests think their bishops are too conservative or too progressive? And we find that that's not the case. You see a nice bell-shaped curve. Both for politics and theology, the majority of priests feel that their bishop is similar to them. And there's about an even distribution on the left and the right, so in terms of priests feeling that their bishop is more conservative or more progressive. So there really is no skew here. It's not like most priests think their bishops are either more progressive or more conservative than they are. Finally, I want to talk to you about priests' attitudes on a number of key issues. We asked priests what they thought ought to be priorities for the church in the United States, and we gave them a number of issues to comment on, and we see that the top priority is shared by three factors: youth and young adult ministry, family formation and marriage preparation, and evangelization. All of these, we see 94% of American priests think that these issues ought to be a priority for the church in the U.S. Then comes poverty and homelessness and food insecurity, pro-life issues, and immigration and refugee assistance. And then Hispanic and Spanish language ministry comes at about 79%, and also social justice about 79%. So these are really the main issues that priests think ought to be priorities. And then beyond that, you start to see a lot more variation. So, 73% on Eucharistic devotion, close to 70% think that racism is an issue that we have to prioritize. Artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, see a lot more uncertainty there among priests. Climate change, only about half of priests think that climate change, synodality, the LGBTQ community ought to be priorities. And you see, a substantial minority of priests who disagree that should be a priority. And again, where you see most priests disagreeing is around the access to the traditional Latin Mass, which is an issue that has received a lot of press, a lot of attention, but only a significant minority of priests think that ought to be an issue that the church ought to prioritize in the U.S., whereas most priests disagree that should be a priority. We then wanted to see how these assessments of priorities break down by ordination cohorts. How do they differ? And we see some important differences. So whereas some of the key issues, the top issues like youth ministry and marriage formation and so on, are equally shared across generations, here on some of these issues like climate change, immigration and refugee assistance, on racism, social justice, synodality, we see that it's primarily the older priests ordained before 1980. Most of them think this ought to be a priority, and only a minority of priests ordained since 2000 think that these issues ought to be prioritized by the church in the U.S., right? You can see there it's only really less than 30% of priests ordained since 2000, for instance, think that synodality ought to be a priority for the church in the U.S. And if you look at some of the other issues like Eucharistic devotion, again, here you see the majority of priests ordained since 2000 think that ought to be a priority compared to a smaller proportion of priests ordained before 1980. Access to TLM, even among priests ordained since 2000, only less than 40% think that ought to be a priority for the church. Something else we wanted to look at is the differences between the extent to which priests think a particular issue ought to be a priority and the extent to which their parish has a dedicated ministry for those issues. And this, what I'm showing you, is the results only for those priests who have a parish assignment. So if they're a pastor or associate pastor and so on. And here you see that 94% again of these priests think that youth and young adult ministry ought to be a priority, but only 71% have a dedicated ministry in their parish. 96% think that evangelization ought to be a priority, but only 49% have a dedicated ministry of any kind. Only 54% have a pro-life ministry. And then as you see for all of these other issues, there's a substantially lower proportion of priests, of parishes that have any kind of dedicated ministry. One of the findings in our subsequent analyses was that parishes that are higher income, located in higher SES communities with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to have dedicated ministries of any kind compared to lower socioeconomic status parishes. Not surprising, so resources are a concern. But another issue might be that potentially the diocese is already offering some of these ministries, and so the parish does not need a dedicated ministry. In any case, this is again another issue which we think merits future inquiry to figure out why it is that we may not be investing in some of the issues that we think ought to be priorities for the church. Let's look now at synodality. And the first thing I want to look at is priests' attitudes towards the synod on synodality itself. And here we just asked them bluntly, do you think the synod on synodality was a waste of time? 37% agree and 39% disagree. We asked priests whether they personally felt fully included in the synod, and we see again more priests disagree than agree. More priests did not feel fully included in the synod. And again, a significantly higher proportion of priests disagreed that the synod on synodality was helpful for their ministry compared to the proportion who thought it was helpful, right? And so the term synodality, the concept of synodality, the experience of the synod, the process of the synod itself, priests are really quite divided about that, very skeptical of that. And yet, what we wanted to do was to assess whether, in practice, if you were to take the indicators of whatever synodality might look like, we look at the documents of the synod, and try to come up with a series of indicators that would show whether synodality was being practiced or not. And we asked priests whether they were doing some of those things. And we find overall, priests seem to be quite synodal in practice. So when you ask priests whether their parish has a pastoral council or similar body that plays an important role in decision-making, 85% of priests with a parish said that they agreed with that statement. 75% of priests who have a parish assignment say that before making significant decisions in their parish, they're actively involving parishioners in prayer and reflection. 69% say their parish provides training or support to help lay people take an active role in the church's mission beyond the parish through evangelization, outreach, service, and so on. 65% say they've changed a parish practice or decision based on lay input. 64% say they intentionally seek out the voices of those less involved in parish life. And 47% say that their parish has formal or structured ways to gather input from parishioners, such as through surveys, focus groups, etc. Some of these factors, again, which came out in the comments after the study, priests suggest that they've been doing these things already for quite some time. So maybe to say that the synod hasn't actually changed anything in their sense of things indicates that, look, we've already been doing this. There's nothing new that's come out of this particular exercise that has changed some of these practices that we're already doing. Only 66% of priests who have a parish assignment said that their parishes participated in the synod. And of that 66%, only half of them actively tried to seek out the voices of people affected by church crises, like survivors of abuse or those who felt excluded from the church. And only 35% of the 66 said that the synod process led to helpful changes in the parish. So again, it raises a lot of questions, and I think it's important for us to assess the effectiveness of the synod and to think about what these findings might mean there. A few other issues. We asked priests about the influence of women in the church, and here what we've done is simply replicated a survey that was asked by the Pew Research Center of the general population, actually of the general Catholic population, and the results we find are identical among priests to the general Catholic public. So 51% of priests think that women do not have enough influence in the church, 45% think women have about the right amount of influence, and 4% think that women have too much influence, whatever they might mean. And these results are really what you would find in the general public among U.S. Catholics as well. We also asked priests about their views of Pope Leo. We conducted our survey shortly after his election, and we find that he's enjoying what we might consider a honeymoon effect. So 86% of priests express a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the Pope, and 80% think that under Pope Leo, relationships between the Vatican and the Church in the U.S. will improve. Again, some of these findings are similar to the public. And finally, one other issue we wanted to look at was priests' political views and opinions. And one of the things we'd seen in our previous wave was that there's an increasing conservatism, both theologically and politically, that we see among priests across cohorts of ordination. And I'm just showing you the political views of priests here. And you can see again, they're over time have become more conservative. And one of the things we wanted to assess was whether this meant that their views of the political, whether they shared the views of the political administration in the U.S. that, say, most conservatives do in this country. And one of the things we found here surprised us, which is that 57% of priests are very or extremely concerned about the policies of the current political administration in the U.S. And if you notice just this breakdown, both across priests' political orientations, as well as by the cohort of ordination, we don't see really a neat symmetry among conservative priests compared to liberal priests, where it's not very surprising that most liberal priests are very or extremely concerned about the policies of the current administration in the US. But we don't see here among conservatives that most of them agree with the current political administration. In fact, they're quite divided in their opinion of the administration, both in terms of priests who identify as conservative and priests who have been ordained since 2000, right? So this suggests that there's a more nuanced picture of the political views of priests than we might think simply by gleaning their political affiliation. So just because priests say that they're conservative or very conservative doesn't mean they're fully aligned with the policies and views of the current administration. And I think this again merits some further inquiry. And the last issue is simply we wanted to assess where priests wanted ongoing formation, what their interests were in ongoing formation. We gave them a number of options to choose from, and they could select any of these, and 61% said they really wanted more spiritual formation, like spiritual direction training, a deepening prayer life, and so on. 55% wanted priest convocations and retreats, 48% expressed interest in priest fellowships and fraternity groups, 48% in doctrinal and theological issues, and then a substantial minority in leadership training and mental health and well-being training and business and administrative training, and far fewer priests indicated an interest in things like Hispanic ministry or ecumenical training or formal education. So in sum, we want to conclude that we see among priests in the past few years the persistence of high levels of personal flourishing. However, we're seeing relatively lower assessments of institutional flourishing, and also somewhat low levels of institutional trust. Even though it's improving, we do see that their average trust in bishops is still not particularly high. The second takeaway is, as we see, that most priests have a broad mission-oriented pastoral vision, but there's a gap between their pastoral aspirations, the sorts of things that they would like to prioritize, and then the institutional realization, what they can actually achieve through dedicated ministries in their parishes. We see that priests are quite tepid about synodality. They're really quite divided about it. And on the whole, from the opinions of priests, it seems the majority of them are not particularly supportive of the synod process, or perhaps even the term, but they are decidedly synodal in practice. And finally, we see that U.S. priests tend to be both conservative and pastorally expansive, and we can't really quite reduce, even by assessing their political views, we can't reduce them to whatever we might typically mean by the term conservative. And again, we think we need to understand that nuanced picture of what it means to be a priest in the U.S. today. So with that, I thank you and welcome your questions and comments.
Yes, my name is Tony, and I was just asking a question about the information on burnout for priests. And is there any other information in terms of having other priests that are there to help them as well, having deacons, having other people involved in that? What level do they need a basis support in order to feel like they were supported, or did they feel like they were more on their own?
Right, yeah, we didn't really have any questions probing that. I mean, that would have been, yeah, unfortunately, we were constrained to a very short 10-minute survey in order to get the response rate as high as possible. But yeah, I think that's an important issue for future work. I don't know if we might have, Stephen, if we have any other indicator that might get at the extent to which they feel supported in their ministry, or
In our earlier study, we did have some indication that factors like isolation, for example, played into this, and the difference on burnout between religious priests and diocesan priests suggests that having access to a living community, a community that you know well, that you not only have chosen but has chosen you, that you, if you're a member of a religious community, chances are you have some say over who your religious superiors are, and when they're done being superior, they're back in the community. So a lot of those would strongly suggest that sort of the community support that comes with being in a religious community is helpful and helps to reduce burnout. You can also see with religious priests, it's easier to be allowed to specialize. If you're particularly good at some aspect of ministry, the community may ask you to focus on that. If you're a priest, particularly if you're the only priest in your parish, you're expected to be a generalist. And whether you're good at that aspect or not, you're responsible for it. So these are more inferences than things that show up in the concrete data. But I think there's a lot of room for further exploration of precisely those questions.
Susan Timoney. I have a question about the not perceiving that the religious communities or dioceses are flourishing. It sounds like that you weren't able to ask a follow-up question, but would imagining conversation probably related to parish mergings and provincial mergings, those kinds of things that on the surface look like it's a lack of flourishing, even though hopefully, right, moving towards something more positive. But that would be interesting to see if it matches up with what the easiest answer to that question is.
Right, yeah. And whether they vary, right? Whether financially strained dioceses might have different sort of experiences of a lack of flourishing compared to maybe where there's been some kind of a scandal or some other issue, or or where maybe they might feel the bureaucratic process is too much, or so there might be a range of factors, but I think
there's also a perception question. That's not exactly an apples to apples comparison there. So the flourishing score that we come up with is not, we never ask the priests, are you flourishing? Right? We ask them a battery of questions that we then interpret as a flourishing score. So that might account for some difference. I wonder if some of the priests who answered those questions come up with a flourishing score that's higher than they would have expected if you just asked them, how would you rate your flourishing on a scale from 1 to 10?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that, but it's interesting. I think that the data here doesn't solve the question, but it points to, if our priests really are flourishing, and our data has always showed that. There's lots of other data apart from our own that shows that priests are flourishing, but there's at least concern, or at least a perception that the communities aren't flourishing. As Brandon pointed out earlier, there's lots more room for investigation there as well.
There are 2 questions from the National Catholic Register. The first question is, did the researchers track which dioceses are thriving the most, or at least in which dioceses the priest respondents felt that it was flourishing the most?
Yeah, we can't. So when you read our report, you'll see at the end that Gallup can't really release that kind of information due to confidentiality reasons. So the part of the research ethics requirements of this project required keeping the dioceses confidential. So we don't, as researchers, have access to which dioceses answered what. It would be nice for us internally to have a ranking of the best and worst dioceses in this country. But alas, we can't do that.
And the second question is, did you gain any insights on seminary culture and how formation given nowadays is shaping the views of priests, both on their political views and their pastoral priorities?
I don't recall if we had a question about seminary formation at all in this. I mean, in our previous wave we did, but we only had questions around whether they had personally experienced abuse in seminary, and we did find actually a small minority, which was a surprisingly higher minority than we thought, that experienced abuse in seminary, but we don't quite have an answer to that question. I know Kara has just put out a report that might be able to get at that.
Yeah, Kara always has interesting data on new ordinands that provides a peek into what the seminary formation was like. Anecdotally, having talked about our data with seminary formators, one of the questions I've asked, it maybe not in quite these terms, was our data shows that younger priests tend to be more theologically and politically conservative than older priests. Are they showing up that way? Are the less conservative priests being weeded out? What's going on? And every formator I've talked to said the young men are showing up that way. So that the more conservative bent theologically and politically among younger priests does not seem to be a direct product of seminary necessarily so much as, or at least is primarily a function of who's entering the seminaries to begin with. So again, that doesn't show up in our data, but that's something I've heard time and again from talking with seminary formators.
And even from comments of priests too, from older generations of priests who complain about this. Yeah.
I'm Rick Howick. I'm the director for the Fulton Sheen Preaching Initiative here at CUA. And I was looking at your interest in ongoing formation from the priests that you had, and I don't see in here their interest in practical application of ministry, such as in preaching. Did you get much data on their desire for continuing formation in that practical application of ministry?
We do have an other category, and so we could look through and see what percentage would have selected that, but it was less than 10% of priests selected anything other than the options we gave them, and they could have, 100% could have selected the other and said, I want more training and preaching help, and they didn't, so whatever that's worth.
I think it's also important, the results we showed were for all priests, and that includes priests who are a bit long in the tooth, who might not be terribly interested in learning new skills or administrative stuff. If you're a priest who's 70 years old, you've either figured out how to work a parish or you haven't, so you might not be interested in that. So for example, one of the things that we've been interested in here at Catholic University is administrative and management training for young priests and seminarians. That didn't score very high on this data, but I think that probably a big reason for that is it probably includes a lot of priests who aren't interested because they're on the sort of the second half of their career and they've either got those skills or are no longer interested in acquiring them. All that's to say, if we were to break this down more by age cohort to see not just what percentage of priests in general are interested in X, Y, or Z, but priests of which age cohort are interested in which, I think that would be interesting. We haven't broken that down, but that would be the interesting thing to look at.
Question about burnout. How much of burnout is a generational problem?
Yeah, I mean, we did break it down a little bit by the different cohorts of ordination, and certainly the priests who are more recently ordained have higher levels of burnout. I'm not quite sure what more we might. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so the burnout, it is higher for the younger group. If you are asking about
You might want to use the microphone there just so that the folks at home can hear.
This is Dr. Stephen Cranning, our data scientist, so he knows what he speaks.
So yeah, we did break out burnout by cohort, and as some might expect, it is higher for the younger cohorts. Now that tracks with what we know about burnout and anxiety and depression in that cohort more generally. So it might not be necessarily sort of a Catholic priestly thing. It might just be a generational thing, but we do see those patterns in the priesthood as well.
This is the question that I have been asked more than any other question by bishops regarding our data. You can formulate the question in a way that seems sort of solicitous for the young priests, and you could also formulate in a way that says, are the young guys just not tough like we used to be? But it's a really important question, and I think, well, it's true that there are certain, as Stephen said, there are certain indicators that say that there is a generational difference in how younger men in particular perceive hard work and stress and how they cope with that. There are generational differences there. It's also clearly the case that young priests in the United States are being asked to do more at a younger age than they have in the past. It's very common nowadays for a priest to be made a pastor after just a few years out from ordination. It used to be the case that it was fairly normal for a priest to have 5 or 10 or even 15 years of essentially an apprenticeship before being put in charge of a parish, and then he would have help in that parish, not just other priests in that parish, but often a religious community in the parish. That's not the case for most priests in the United States anymore. I use this example a lot. My colleagues know this story well. I know a priest in the Midwest who upon ordination was made pastor of 6 parishes. That's not a learning curve, that's a brick wall. And so when priests are being asked to do more and more, obviously that's going to fall more and more on the younger priests. So it's not surprising that we see elevated burnout among them. You might even turn it around and say, given the current situation, it's perhaps surprising we don't see more burnout among younger priests.
This is one last question, and it's pretty general for both of you as both researchers and as fathers. What does this data suggest about the future of the priesthood in the United States? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What do you think? How do you think we're doing?
There are a lot of components to the data, right? I mean, I think in terms of just simply the well-being levels, like individual flourishing, the fact that people thrive in a particular profession, it's a good sign. And then they, generally have high morale, a sense of commitment to their vocation. That seems pretty high. Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at priests who are struggling and the attrition, which we're hearing stories about. So, I think that's an important thing for us to address. But there is, I think, in a sense that it's healthy that the majority are doing well. And then whatever the modest signs of improvement in trust in bishops indicates, I think that's a good sign. I think our hope is that'll continue to improve, and I think we need to see both bishops taking more effort towards figuring out how to rebuild trust, and then I think we also need more research to try to figure out what actually are the mechanisms through which such trust can be rebuilt. I think these are good signs. I think the polarization within the priesthood that we pointed out in our previous study is a concern. Do priests across generations not trust each other very well? How is that going to continue? And maybe some of these issues around, as you see, the sort of the reception to the synod, right? That created certainly some tensions between the Church in the U.S. and the Vatican. So perhaps those will improve under Leo's pontificates. I think there are a lot of good signs of hope, but I think also avenues for us to better inquire into. And certainly these issues around burnout, around how newer generations of priests are going to manage the burdens that they're going to face, the financial crisis in the church, that's a huge issue. Beyond the sex abuse crisis, the financial crisis of the various dioceses in this country that are struggling. I think those are really important issues. So whether or not priests want ongoing formation and how to deal with financial issues, they need it, right? So I'll let Steve continue.
Amen. I think in general I am hopeful, which is a slightly different thing than optimistic. I'm hopeful because I have been impressed with the priests that the priests that I've met just through my life, but the priests that we've met through our work on this study. I think I'm also hopeful because the data helps us to identify what some of the challenges coming down the pike are, so that we can sort of get ahead of them. I think particularly with some of the generational challenges, there is a very clear sort of trend among priests when it comes to their sort of theological views or their political views. Take the theological views, for example. Understanding understanding that trend, but understanding what it means and what it doesn't mean, is really important to understanding how the Church in the United States is going to deal with challenges coming in the decades to come. I think some of the nuance that our data points out cuts against the grain of some stereotypes of what priests in the United States, or young priests in the United States in particular, are. It's true that they're politically and theologically conservative, but there's a much more nuanced view, and I think their flexibility is going to be important, because the fact is that's what the future of the American presbyterate is going to look like. Get a couple more years on that. There doesn't seem to be any sign of a reversal of that trend, but it also means there's no indication that I've seen that the rest of the American Catholic Church has such a clear and distinct trend, right? So how well will these young priests be able to minister to congregations that may not look like them or sound like them or think like them on a lot of things? That's a challenge. But knowing that now, understanding those trends, these long-term trends ahead of time, makes it easier to come up with creative responses to those challenges, to turn challenges into opportunities, rather than just sort of waiting until friction starts creating smoke and then fire. So I'm like I said, I'm hopeful long-term, but there are plenty of challenges lying along the road ahead.
All right, well, with that, we thank you all again for joining us, and those of you watching as well.